I was standing at my kitchen window with my morning coffee when I saw the HOA president, Brenda Matthews, marching across my property with a clipboard and 3 workers trailing behind her like obedient ducklings. My stock pond, which I had spent 2 years and $15,000 building, sat peacefully in the morning sun about 50 yards from my house, completely unaware of what was about to happen. "Hey," I shouted, throwing open my back door and jogging across the lawn.
"What are you doing on my property?"
Brenda turned to face me with that practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. She was 52, wore her blonde hair in that weird asymmetrical bob that seemed to be the uniform for women in positions of minor authority, and carried herself like she was the CEO of a Fortune 500 company instead of the volunteer president of a suburban HOA in Riverside, California. "Good morning, Warren," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We are here to address a code violation that has been brought to the board's attention." "What code violation?" I asked, my grip tightening on the coffee mug I was still holding. "I got approval for this pond 2 years ago. I have the paperwork." She flipped through pages on her clipboard with theatrical flair. "Yes, well, that was under the previous administration. We have done a comprehensive review of all structures on community properties, and your pond exceeds the allowable water feature size by approximately 800 square feet. "That is insane," I said, feeling heat rise in my chest. "The previous board signed off on this." I showed them the plans. Everything was approved. "Nevertheless," Brenda continued, completely unfazed, "the current board has voted to require remediation. You have been sent 3 notices over the past month. I have not received a single notice." I shot back. "Not one." She made a show of checking her clipboard again. "According to our records, notices were sent to 2847 Willow Creek Drive on April 15th, April 29th, and May 10th. "That is not even my address," I said, my voice rising. "My address is 2847 Willow Creek Circle. You have been sending notices to the wrong house this entire time." Brenda's expression did not change. "Regardless of any clerical errors, the violation remains. We are authorized by Section 7.3 of the HOA covenants to take corrective action when homeowners fail to comply with remediation orders." "You cannot just drain my pond," I said, stepping between her and the workers. "This is my property. That pond is stocked with bass and bluegill. I have a full ecosystem established here. Actually, Mr. Patterson, according to the deed restrictions you agreed to when you purchased this home, the HOA does have the authority to take necessary action to bring properties into compliance." She gestured to the workers. "These gentlemen are going to drain your pond down to the acceptable size of 400 square feet. The process should take about 6 hours. "This is theft," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "You are destroying my property." "This is compliance enforcement," Brenda corrected. "Now, if you will excuse us, we have work to do. You are welcome to file an appeal with the board at our next meeting on June 3rd. I stood there, absolutely stunned, as the workers moved past me and began setting up industrial pumps at the edge of my pond. One of them, a younger guy who would not meet my eyes, unrolled thick hoses and positioned them to drain the water into the storm drains that ran along the street. "You cannot be serious," I said, following Brenda as she walked back toward the front of my property. "Where is that water even going to go?" "Into the municipal drainage system," she said without turning around. "It is all perfectly legal and properly permitted." "And the fish? You should have thought about that before violating HOA regulations." She climbed into her white Mercedes SUV and drove off, leaving me standing in my front yard in my pajamas and slippers, holding a coffee mug and watching my property get destroyed. By noon, my pond was half empty. The water level had dropped so dramatically that fish were struggling in the shallows, gasping and flopping. I spent 3 desperate hours netting as many as I could and transferring them to hastily purchased plastic tubs and buckets that I filled with a garden hose. My neighbor, Tom Rodriguez, came over to help after seeing me running back and forth. "This is messed up, man," Tom said, scooping up a nice largemouth bass and gently placing it in one of the tubs. "I cannot believe they are actually doing this." "I cannot either," I muttered, watching thousands of gallons of water pour down the street and into the storm drains. 2 years of work, just gone. What are you going to do?" "I am going to that HOA meeting," I said, "and I am going to raise hell." By 6 that evening, the workers had finished. My beautiful pond, which had been 1,200 square feet of carefully balanced aquatic ecosystem, was now a muddy depression with a small puddle in the center. Dead fish floated in what little water remained. The edges were lined with dying water plants and exposed liner. It looked like a disaster zone. I took photos, lots of photos. Then I called my lawyer. "Warren, this is definitely actionable," said my attorney, Marcus Chen, after I explained what had happened. "Did you sign anything when they came to your property?" "No, nothing. They just up and did it, and you have documentation showing your original approval? Every email, every document, every signed form. It is all in my files." "Good. Start gathering everything. We are going to need to move fast on this." In the meantime, file a formal complaint with the HOA board and make sure you get a receipt showing they received it. I spent that night drafting a 10-page complaint, citing every relevant section of California property law I could find. I attached copies of my original approval documents, photos of the destruction, and a detailed breakdown of my financial losses. The next morning, I hand-delivered it to Brenda's house and made her sign a receipt confirming she had received it. "This will be reviewed at the next board meeting," she said, barely glancing at the document. "It better be," I said, "because if it is not, you are going to be hearing from my lawyer." She closed the door in my face. The next week was torture. Every time I looked out my back window, I saw the ruins of my pond. The fish I had managed to save were crammed into temporary containers, and I was doing everything I could to keep them alive with aerators and water treatments. Some of them did not make it. Every dead fish felt like a personal failure. Then on May 28th it rained. Not just a light spring shower, but a real Southern California deluge. The kind of rain that turns freeways into rivers and sends weather reporters to stand on bridges with their hair blowing sideways. I watched the water pour from the sky and thought about my drained pond, about how it would have handled this storm just fine with its properly designed overflow system. Around 3 in the afternoon, my phone rang. It was Tom. "Warren, you need to come outside and see this," he said, his voice urgent. I grabbed a raincoat and stepped out onto my front porch. The street was flooded, not just a little water in the gutters, but a genuine river flowing past my house. But that was not the shocking part. The shocking part was where the water was coming from. The HOA had built a retention basin the previous year right at the end of our cul-de-sac. It was supposed to handle stormwater runoff for the entire neighborhood. As I watched, water was pouring over the top of the basin like a waterfall, flooding directly into the street and flowing past everyone's houses. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," I muttered. I sloshed through the water to get a better look. The retention basin was completely overwhelmed, filled to the brim and beyond. Water was cascading over the edges in sheets, carrying mud and debris with it, and it was all flowing down the street, pooling in driveways and creeping up toward people's garages. Tom appeared next to me, holding an umbrella that was doing absolutely nothing in the driving rain. "That thing is a disaster. I think they did not build it right, or they did not build it big enough," I said, watching the water continue to rise. "How much do you want to bet this is going to flood someone's house?" As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text from the neighborhood group chat. It was from Sarah Chen, who lived 3 houses down from me. "Water is coming into my garage. This is bad." Then another text from David Walsh. "My basement is flooding. What is happening?" I called Brenda's number. It rang 6 times before going to voicemail. I left a message, trying to keep my voice level. "Brenda, this is Warren Patterson. The retention basin is overflowing and flooding the street. Multiple houses are taking on water. You need to get someone out here immediately." No response. I tried the HOA emergency number. No answer. I tried every board member whose number I had. Nothing. "We should call the city," Tom suggested. I dialed Riverside's Public Works emergency line and explained the situation. They promised to send someone out, but warned that they were dealing with flooding all over the city and it might be a few hours. By 6 that evening, the rain had finally stopped, but the damage was done. 4 houses on our street had taken on water. Sarah's garage was flooded with 3 inches of standing water that had ruined her husband's workshop. David's basement had 6 inches and his water heater had been damaged. The Johnsons' house, which sat at the lowest point on the street, had water that had seeped through their back door and ruined their hardwood floors. And through it all, the HOA was completely silent. The next day, I drove to the retention basin to get a better look. In the morning sun, the problem was obvious. The basin had been built to handle runoff, but whoever designed it had seriously underestimated the capacity needed. The drainage pipes were too small, the overflow system was inadequate, and the entire structure was undersized for a neighborhood of this size. I took more photos. Video too. I documented everything. That afternoon, a city inspector showed up. Her name was Patricia Andrews, and she was not happy. I watched from my porch as she examined the retention basin, took measurements, and made notes on a tablet. After about an hour, she knocked on my door. "Mr. Patterson, that is me. I understand you were one of the first to report the flooding yesterday?" I was. "And I am one of the homeowners whose property was damaged by the HOA recently." Her eyebrows rose. "Oh, tell me about that." I explained the whole pond situation. Her expression got darker with every sentence. "Do you have documentation of your original approval?" "Everything." "Would you be willing to share copies with the city? Because what you are describing, combined with what I am seeing with this retention basin, suggests a pattern of the HOA making decisions without proper engineering review or permits." "Absolutely," I said. "What did you find with the basin?" Patricia glanced back at the structure. "Between you and me, that thing should never have been approved. If it was approved at all, I am going to need to pull all the permits and engineering plans. But based on what I am seeing, this is a major problem. The capacity is completely inadequate for this size neighborhood, and the construction quality is questionable at best. What happens now? Now I file a report with the city. They will investigate, and depending on what we find, there could be serious consequences for whoever approved this project. Over the next few days, things escalated quickly. The neighbors whose houses had been flooded were furious and looking for someone to blame. The HOA finally responded with a mass email claiming the flooding was an unprecedented weather event and that they bore no responsibility for the damages. That did not go over well. On June 2nd, the day before the scheduled HOA meeting, I received a letter from the city. The retention basin had been built without proper permits. The engineering plans that had been submitted were inadequate and did not meet city code. And the construction company that built it was not properly licensed for this type of work. The letter concluded that the HOA board was being held responsible, and that legal action was being considered. I made copies of that letter for every neighbor on my street. The HOA meeting on June 3rd was unlike anything I had ever seen. The community center meeting room, which usually held maybe 20 people at these things, was packed with over 100 angry homeowners. The air was electric with tension. Brenda sat at the front table with 4 other board members, all of them looking like they wanted to be anywhere else. Her usual confident smile was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped expression that suggested she knew she was in trouble. "We will now open the floor for homeowner comments," she began, her voice lacking its usual authority. I was the first one to the microphone. "My name is Warren Patterson, and on May 20th the HOA drained my stock pond without my permission, without proper notice, and without any regard for the destruction they were causing." I held up my folder of documents. "I have proof that I received approval for this pond under the previous board. I have proof that the notices of violation were sent to the wrong address, and I have documentation of $15,000 in damages to my property, plus the loss of dozens of fish and aquatic plants that cannot be replaced." The room erupted in murmurs. Brenda tried to interrupt, but I kept going. Then, 1 week later, the retention basin that this board approved and built flooded our entire street, causing water damage to at least 4 homes that I know of. And now we have learned that this basin was built without proper permits, with inadequate engineering, and by an unlicensed contractor. I placed the city's letter on the table in front of Brenda. "This is from the City of Riverside Public Works Department. It confirms everything I just said. So my question for the board is simple. What are you going to do to make this right?" The room burst into applause. Other homeowners lined up behind me at the microphone, each with their own story of damage and frustration. Sarah Chen described her flooded garage and destroyed workshop equipment. "My husband had $20,000 worth of tools and equipment in there, all ruined. Who is going to pay for that?" David Walsh talked about his basement. "The water heater is shot. The drywall is destroyed. We are talking about tens of thousands in repairs. And my insurance company is saying it is not covered because this was due to HOA negligence." Margaret Johnson, a retired teacher whose house had suffered the worst flooding, had tears in her eyes as she spoke. "My floors are ruined, my furniture is ruined, and I am on a fixed income. I cannot afford to fix this. What am I supposed to do?" Brenda tried multiple times to respond, but each time she was drowned out by angry voices. Finally, she stood up and held up her hands. "Please, everyone, let me speak. The board takes these concerns very seriously. We are reviewing all of the incidents and working with our insurance company to determine the appropriate response." "That is not good enough," someone shouted from the back. "We want answers now," another voice called out. "The board needs time to conduct a proper investigation," Brenda insisted, her voice rising. "We cannot make decisions in this kind of hostile environment." "You made the decision to drain my pond pretty quickly," I shot back. "You did not need an investigation for that." The crowd roared its approval. One of the other board members, a man named Richard Stewart, stood up. He was in his 60s, had been on the board for 3 years, and generally seemed like a reasonable guy who had gotten pulled into Brenda's orbit. "I think we need to address something," Richard said, looking uncomfortable. "I was not aware that the retention basin had been built without proper permits. That information was not shared with the full board." All eyes turned to Brenda. "What are you talking about?" she said, her face reddening. "The board approved the retention basin project. The board approved the concept," Richard corrected. "But the actual construction, the contractor selection, the permitting, all of that was handled by you, Brenda. You told us it was all taken care of." Another board member, Linda Vasquez, nodded. "That is true. Brenda managed the entire project. We just voted to approve the budget." Brenda looked like she had been slapped. "I was acting in my capacity as board president. I had authority to manage the project." "But you did not have authority to skip the permitting process," Richard said. "And you definitely did not have authority to hire an unlicensed contractor. The meeting dissolved into chaos after that. Homeowners were shouting, board members were arguing with each other, and Brenda was frantically flipping through papers trying to defend herself. Eventually, someone called for a vote of no confidence in the board leadership. The vote passed 93-12. Brenda gathered her things and stormed out of the meeting, leaving the remaining board members to pick up the pieces. Over the next week, the full scope of the disaster became clear. The HOA's insurance company denied coverage for the retention basin flooding, claiming that the use of an unlicensed contractor and failure to obtain proper permits constituted gross negligence and voided the policy. The city of Riverside issued a formal violation notice and demanded that the retention basin be rebuilt to code within 90 days at the HOA's expense. And then the lawsuit started. I filed mine first, a civil suit against the HOA for $15,000 in property damage, plus additional damages for emotional distress and punitive damages for willful misconduct. My lawyer argued that the HOA had acted with deliberate disregard for my property rights in California law. Sarah and her husband filed for $20,000, David filed for $35,000, the Johnsons filed for $40,000. By the end of June, the HOA was facing over $200,000 in lawsuits from homeowners. But the real bombshell came in early July. The city of Riverside completed its investigation and discovered that Brenda had not just hired an unlicensed contractor, she had hired her brother-in-law. And she had paid him $30,000 more than the next lowest bid. And she had done all of this without disclosing her relationship to the board or the homeowners. That was when the criminal charges came. On July 15th, 2 detectives from the Riverside Police Department showed up at Brenda's house and arrested her for embezzlement, fraud, and misuse of HOA funds. California law treats HOA funds as a form of trust, and what Brenda had done constituted a serious breach of fiduciary duty. I watched from my porch as they led her out in handcuffs. She was crying and protesting her innocence, but the detectives were unmoved. They put her in the back of their car and drove away. The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People were shocked, angry, relieved, and vindicated all at once. The woman who had terrorized us with petty rule enforcement and power trips was finally facing real consequences. The criminal case moved faster than I expected. Brenda's lawyer tried to argue that she had made mistakes but had not acted with criminal intent. But the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed she had received kickbacks from her brother-in-law after the retention basin project was completed. Email records showed she had deliberately hidden his relationship to her. And testimony from other board members proved she had lied repeatedly about the permitting and licensing issues. In September, Brenda pleaded guilty to embezzlement and fraud charges. She was sentenced to 18 months in county jail, ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, and banned from serving on any HOA board in California for life. Meanwhile, the civil lawsuits were settled. The HOA's remaining board members, led by Richard Stewart, who had been elected as the new president, negotiated a settlement with all the affected homeowners. My pond was restored at HOA expense, better than it had been before. Sarah got her garage repaired and her husband's equipment replaced. David's basement was rebuilt. The Johnsons got new floors and new furniture. The retention basin was demolished and rebuilt properly, this time with licensed contractors, proper permits, and engineering oversight from the city. It cost the HOA an additional $70,000, but at least it was done right. By October, things had finally started to return to normal. My pond was full again, restocked with fish, and looking better than ever. The HOA had even paid for upgraded filtration and aeration systems as part of the settlement. I spent a Saturday afternoon sitting by the water, watching bass cruise through the shallows and listening to the sound of the aerator fountain. Tom came over with a couple of beers and sat down next to me. "Nice pond," he said. "Thanks. It is good to have it back. I still cannot believe everything that happened. It was like watching a bad movie, except it was real life." "I know. And the crazy thing is, none of it had to happen. If Brenda had just followed the rules, none of this would have occurred. Power corrupts, man. Give someone a little authority and some of them just lose their minds." We sat in silence for a moment, watching the sun set over the water. "So what is the new board like?" Tom asked. "Actually pretty good. Richard is doing a solid job. They are being transparent about everything, getting proper approvals for projects, and actually listening to homeowners. It is like night and day." "That is good to hear." "Yeah, I still do not love having an HOA. But at least now it feels like they are working for us instead of against us." My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, my lawyer. "Final settlement check cleared. You should see it in your account tomorrow." I showed Tom the message. "Well, that is that. Finally done with all of this. What are you going to do with the money?" I looked at my pond, thinking about everything it had been through. "I think I am going to add some koi. Really make this thing special. And maybe build a deck out here so I can enjoy it properly." "Sounds like a plan." We finished our beers as the last light faded from the sky. Crickets started their evening chorus, and I could hear fish occasionally breaking the surface of the water. Everything felt peaceful, settled. Right, the next day I got a call from Patricia Andrews, the city inspector who had started the whole investigation. "Mr. Patterson, I wanted to let you know that the retention basin passed its final inspection yesterday. It is fully functional and built to code. That is great news. Thank you for everything you did on this. I was just doing my job. But I have to tell you, this case really highlighted some problems with HOA oversight. The city is actually looking at implementing new regulations to require engineering review and permitting for all major HOA projects. Your situation might end up helping a lot of people. I am glad something good came out of it." "Me too, enjoy your pond." I hung up and walked out to my backyard. The morning sun was hitting the water just right, making it sparkle. The plants around the edge had grown in thick and healthy. A great blue heron was standing in the shallows, hunting for breakfast. It was perfect. Later that week, I attended my first HOA meeting under the new board. The atmosphere was completely different. Richard ran the meeting efficiently but fairly, making sure everyone who wanted to speak had a chance. The other board members actually seemed interested in hearing from homeowners instead of just dictating to them. When it came time for new business, Richard brought up a proposal to create an architectural review committee with clearer guidelines and an appeals process. "We want to make sure that what happened to Warren never happens again. Every homeowner deserves to know the rules up front and to have a fair process if there is ever a dispute." The proposal passed unanimously. After the meeting, Richard pulled me aside. "Hey Warren, I wanted to apologize again for what happened with your pond. I should have been paying closer attention to what Brenda was doing." "You could not have known," I said. "She was actively hiding things from the board." "Maybe. But I still feel like I let the neighborhood down. I let you down. The important thing is you did the right thing once you found out. Not everyone would have stood up to her like you did." He nodded, looking relieved. "Thanks. And listen, I know you probably never want to be involved with the HOA again after everything that happened, but if you ever want to join a committee or get more involved, we would love to have you. We need people who are willing to stand up for what is right." I thought about it. 6 months ago, I would have laughed at the idea. But now, seeing how much difference good leadership made, I could see the value in staying engaged. "Let me think about it," I said. "Maybe in a few months, once everything is really settled." "Fair enough. The offer is open whenever you are ready." I drove home that night feeling something I had not felt about my neighborhood in a long time, hopeful. The nightmare of the past few months was finally over. Brenda was in jail where she belonged. The retention basin was fixed. My pond was better than ever. Justice had been served. But more than that, the neighborhood had come together. People who had never talked to each other before were now friends. We had a new sense of community, born out of shared struggle and shared victory. The HOA, which had been a source of fear and frustration, was slowly becoming what it was supposed to be, a way for neighbors to work together to make their community better. In November, I got the final piece of closure I needed. The check from the settlement cleared, and I used part of it to build that deck I had been thinking about. I hired a local contractor, got all the proper permits, and even submitted the plans to the HOA for approval before starting work. The whole process was smooth and professional. Richard and the Architectural Review Committee approved my plans in less than a week. The deck turned out beautifully. It wrapped around 2 sides of the pond, with built-in benches and underwater lighting that made the water glow at night. I added the koi I had been planning, watching them swirl in patterns of orange, white, and black beneath the surface. On Thanksgiving weekend, I hosted a gathering at my place. Tom and his family came, along with Sarah and her husband, David and his wife, and the Johnsons. We stood on the new deck, drinking hot cider and watching the fish, and someone proposed a toast. "To Warren," Sarah said, raising her glass. "For standing up to the HOA and fighting for all of us." "To justice," David added. "To new beginnings," Margaret Johnson said, smiling. We clinked glasses and drank, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the cider. These people were not just neighbors anymore. They were friends, they were community. "You know what the best part is?" Tom said, looking at the pond. "This thing is even better than it was before. Brenda tried to destroy it, and instead she just made it stronger." "That is a good metaphor for the whole neighborhood," I said. "We went through hell, but we came out better on the other side." As the sun set that evening and my friends lingered on the deck, laughing and talking and enjoying the peaceful sound of water, I realized that this was what a neighborhood should feel like. This was what an HOA could be when it was run by people who actually cared about the community instead of just wielding power. I thought about Brenda, sitting in a jail cell, and felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction because justice had been served, sadness because none of it had to happen. She could have been a good HOA president if she had just followed the rules and treated people with respect. Instead, she let power go to her head and destroyed her own life in the process. But that was not my burden to carry. I had my pond, my friends, and my peace of mind. Everything else was just noise. The following spring, something unexpected happened. I was elected to the HOA board. I had not planned on running, but several neighbors approached me and basically insisted. They said they trusted me to keep the board honest and to make sure the mistakes of the past never happened again. So I agreed. My first board meeting was in April, exactly 1 year after Brenda had drained my pond. The symbolism was not lost on me. I sat at the table where she had once sat, but I approached the role completely differently. Every decision we made was transparent. Every homeowner concern was taken seriously. Every project was properly permitted and engineered. At one point during the meeting, we reviewed a request from a homeowner who wanted to build a small pond in their backyard. The old me might have found that funny, but instead I carefully reviewed the plans, made sure everything was up to code, and recommended approval. "Motion passes," Richard said, looking at me with a slight smile. "Looks like we are pro-pond now. Imagine that," I said, and everyone laughed. After the meeting, I drove home and parked in my driveway. I could see my pond from the car, glowing softly under the lights I had installed. The water was calm and clear. The fish were healthy and thriving. The plants were lush and green. Everything was exactly as it should be. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, the anger I had felt watching my pond being drained, the frustration of dealing with Brenda's tyranny, the shock of seeing the retention basin overflow and flood the street, the satisfaction of watching her get arrested, the relief of seeing justice served. But mostly I thought about the lesson in all of it. HOAs are not inherently evil. They are just organizations run by people, and people can be good or bad, fair or corrupt, reasonable or tyrannical. The key is vigilance. The key is participation. The key is never letting anyone have unchecked power over your community. I got out of my car and walked to the edge of my pond. A large koi surfaced near my feet, its orange and white scales catching the light. I knelt down and trailed my fingers in the water, feeling the cool liquid against my skin. "We made it," I said to the fish, feeling only slightly ridiculous for talking to them. "We actually made it through." The koi swam away in lazy circles, unbothered by human drama, focused only on the simple pleasure of moving through clean water under a starry sky. I envied them their simplicity. But I also knew that my own journey, complicated and painful as it had been, had taught me something valuable. It had taught me to stand up for myself, to document everything, to not back down when I was right, to seek justice even when it was hard, and most importantly, to get involved and make sure the systems that governed my life were fair and just. The retention basin sat at the end of the street, quietly doing its job. It was properly built now, properly maintained, and functioning exactly as it should. When it rained, it collected water and slowly released it into the municipal system, preventing flooding and protecting homes. It was boring and functional and perfect. That was what good governance looked like. Boring and functional and perfect. No drama, no corruption, no power trips. Just competent people doing their jobs and serving their community. I stood up and looked around my backyard. The deck, the pond, the landscaping, all of it represented not just my vision but my victory. Brenda had tried to take it from me and she had failed. The HOA had tried to destroy it, and instead they had been forced to rebuild it better than before. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Wanted to let you know Brenda's restitution payment cleared. That's officially the end of the case. Congratulations on seeing it through." I typed back a quick thanks and put my phone away. The case was over. The drama was over. The nightmare was over. Life in my neighborhood returned to a comfortable rhythm. The HOA functioned smoothly under Richard's leadership and with my involvement on the board. We approved reasonable requests, denied unreasonable ones, and always followed proper procedures. When homeowners had complaints, we listened. When projects needed to be done, we got proper bids, proper permits, and proper oversight. It was not exciting. It was not dramatic. It was just good, solid, boring governance. And that was exactly what the neighborhood needed. On the 1-year anniversary of Brenda's arrest, someone organized a neighborhood barbecue at the community center. Over 100 people showed up. There was no agenda, no meeting, no official business. Just neighbors gathering to celebrate their community and the fact that they had survived a really difficult year together. I brought a dish and mingled with people, many of whom I had never really talked to before all the drama started. It was amazing how much stronger the neighborhood felt now. We had been through something together, and it had bonded us in a way that normal suburban life never would have. As the evening wound down and people started to leave, Margaret Johnson approached me. She looked healthier than she had in months, the stress of the previous year finally lifting from her shoulders. "Warren, I never properly thanked you," she said. "If you had not stood up to Brenda, if you had not fought back, I do not know what would have happened to my house. I could not have afforded those repairs on my own." "You do not need to thank me," I said. "I was just doing what was right, maybe." But not everyone does what is right, especially when it is hard. You did, and it made all the difference. She gave me a hug and walked away, leaving me standing there feeling a complicated mix of emotions. Pride, certainly, but also humility, because the truth was I had not set out to be a hero or to save the neighborhood. I had just been angry about my pond and determined not to let someone get away with destroying my property. Everything else had just cascaded from that single act of standing up for myself. As I drove home that night, I thought about the question that had been nagging at me for months. What would have happened if I had not fought back? If I had just accepted the loss of my pond and moved on? The retention basin still would have flooded. Brenda's corruption still would have existed. But would anyone have stood up to her? Would anyone have pushed for accountability? Maybe. Maybe not. But the fact that I had stood up, that I had fought, had made it easier for others to do the same. And together we had made real change. That was the power of not backing down. Not because you are a hero, but because you refuse to let wrong go unchallenged. I pulled into my driveway and sat in my car for a moment, looking at my house, my yard, my pond. Everything looked peaceful in the moonlight. The water reflected the sky like a mirror. The plants swayed gently in the evening breeze. The fish moved beneath the surface in their endless, graceful dance. This was home. This was my piece of the world, and I had fought to protect it and won. I got out of the car and walked to the edge of the pond one more time. Tomorrow I would go to work. Tomorrow I would deal with whatever normal life threw at me. Tomorrow I would attend another HOA meeting and help make boring, sensible decisions about street repairs and landscaping contracts. But tonight I just wanted to stand here and appreciate what I had. A beautiful pond, a good neighborhood, friends who had my back, and the knowledge that when push came to shove, I had stood up for what was right. The koi swam to the surface, perhaps expecting food. I did not have any, but I watched them anyway, their movements hypnotic and calming. They had no idea what they had been through, no memory of being netted and saved, no understanding of the battle that had been fought to preserve their home. But I remembered, and I always would. As I finally turned to go inside, I took one last look at the pond, at the deck, at everything that represented both the worst and best of the past year. The reflection of the moon shimmered on the water's surface, and for just a moment everything felt absolutely perfect. Justice had been served. The guilty had been punished. The innocent had been compensated. The system, flawed as it was, had ultimately worked. And I had learned that standing up for yourself, documenting everything, and refusing to back down when you are right can actually make a difference. It was not a lesson I had wanted to learn. The cost had been high in terms of stress, time, and emotional energy. But it was a lesson I would carry with me for the rest of my life. And as I closed my back door and looked out the window one final time at my beautiful, restored, better than ever pond glowing softly in the moonlight, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Peace, real, genuine, hard-won peace, and that, more than any settlement check or legal victory, was worth everything I had been through.